Mysterious Graves, Legends and Controversies. A narrated documentary script. Welcome to a journey unlike any other. Tonight we're going to walk among the dead, not to mourn them, but to discover the stories they left behind. Stories wrapped in mystery, soaked in controversy, and haunted, sometimes quite literally, by legends that refuse to die. Over the next several hours, we'll visit 60 graves scattered across this country and beyond, each one hiding something extraordinary beneath the surface. Some belong to names you'll know the moment you hear them. Others will surprise you. All of them carry a shadow, a question mark, a whispered rumor, a dark legend that has followed them long past their final breath. So settle in, and let us begin where every good mystery should begin, with the king. There is no grave in America more visited, more debated, and more surrounded by conspiracy than the one at Graceland in Memphis, Tennessee. Elvis Aaron Presley, the boy from Tupelo, Mississippi, who became the most famous entertainer the world has ever known, rests in the meditation garden alongside his parents and his grandmother. Or does he? Elvis died on August 16, 1977, at the age of 42. His girlfriend, Ginger Alden, found him unresponsive on the bathroom floor. The official cause of death was cardiac arrhythmia, though the full autopsy results were sealed by his father, Vernon, and won't be released until 2027. That sealed autopsy is the first thread in a tapestry of conspiracy that has only grown thicker over the decades. 9 days after Elvis was buried at Forest Hill Cemetery, 3 men were caught attempting to steal his body, apparently planning to hold it for ransom. That botched grave robbery led Vernon to petition the city of Memphis to move both Elvis and his mother Gladys to Graceland, where they could be guarded around the clock. The request was granted, and there they remain today. But the mysteries didn't end with the move. A devoted subculture of believers who call themselves Alivers insist Elvis faked his death. They point to the spelling on his tombstone, Aaron, instead of the Aaron on his birth certificate, as a coded message. They cite sightings at airports, at Graceland itself, even a singing pastor in Arkansas named Bob Joyce who bears a striking resemblance. Some claim Elvis was a federal informant working with the DEA and entered witness protection to escape mob threats. Others note the extremely heavy casket. The family says it was copper-lined, but rumors persist that it was weighted to disguise a dummy inside. Whether you believe any of it or not, the sheer volume of theories surrounding this one grave makes it the most controversial burial site in American history. Every year on the anniversary of his death, thousands gather in Memphis for a candlelight vigil, walking past the grave in the garden. Some come to pay respects. Some come still looking for proof that the king never really left the building. From the most famous grave in rock and roll to the most famous grave in the occult, we travel now to New Orleans, Louisiana, and the crumbling, sun-bleached labyrinth of St. Louis Cemetery, No. 1. This is the oldest existing cemetery in the city, established in 1789, and it holds over 100,000 burials crammed into a single city block. But there is one tomb here that draws more visitors than all the rest combined, the final resting place of Marie Laveau, the Voodoo Queen of New Orleans. Marie Laveau was born a free woman of color around 1801 and became the most powerful practitioner of voodoo in American history. She was a hairdresser by trade, which gave her access to the private homes and private secrets of New Orleans' wealthiest families. She used that information, along with her spiritual rituals, to build an empire of influence that rivaled any politician's. Her tomb has been the subject of legends for over a century. For decades, visitors would scratch 3 X marks onto the whitewashed surface and knock 3 times, believing Laveau would grant their wish from beyond the grave. The practice became so widespread and so damaging to the stonework that the cemetery was eventually closed to all visitors except those on licensed tours. That hasn't stopped the legends. People claim to have seen Laveau's ghost wandering the cemetery grounds, recognizable by her red and white turban and brightly colored clothing. Some say she appears on St. John's Eve, June 23rd, the most sacred night in the voodoo calendar. Others report being scratched, shoved, or pinched by an unseen force if they speak disrespectfully near her tomb. The exact location of her remains is itself a matter of debate. Some historians believe she may actually be in a different, unmarked tomb elsewhere in the cemetery. But the legend doesn't care about historical accuracy. The legend has a life of its own, and in New Orleans, that's the only kind that matters. Marie Laveau died in 1881, reportedly at the age of 79, though even her birth year is disputed. She left behind a daughter who carried on her name and her practice, which only deepened the mystery. Were the later sightings of the mother or the daughter? In New Orleans, the dead don't always stay dead, and they certainly don't stay quiet. Let's leave the swamps of Louisiana and head west to California, to the story of a young man who lived fast, died young, and left behind a legend some say is literally cursed. James Dean made only 3 films: East of Eden, Rebel Without a Cause, and Giant, before he was killed in a car crash on September 30th, 1955, at the age of 24. He was driving his silver Porsche 550 Spyder, which he had nicknamed Little Bastard, on his way to a racing event in Salinas, California, when he collided with another car at an intersection near Cholam. Dean was pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital. His death was tragic but straightforward. What happened to the car afterward was anything but. The wreckage was purchased by car customizer George Barris, and almost immediately, strange things began to happen. While being unloaded from the delivery truck, the car rolled off and broke a mechanic's legs. The engine and drivetrain were sold to 2 different racing enthusiasts. One crashed and was injured, the other was killed in a separate race. Tires from the Spyder were sold to a man who experienced simultaneous blowouts on the highway. The body shell, while on display as part of a highway safety exhibit, fell off its mount and broke a teenager's hip. The garage storing the shell caught fire, but the Spyder survived, only for it to fall off its display pedestal again during another showing, this time in New Orleans, breaking the hip of a visitor. The California Highway Patrol used the wreck for traffic safety demonstrations until 1960, when the car vanished while being transported from Miami to Los Angeles. It has never been found. Was there a curse on James Dean's car? Probably not. But try telling that to the people who touched it. Dean is buried at Park Cemetery in Fairmount, Indiana, the small town where he was raised by his aunt and uncle after his mother's death. His grave has been a pilgrimage site for 7 decades, and fans still leave flowers, cigarettes, and sometimes red jackets in tribute to his role in Rebel Without a Cause. From one Hollywood legend to the most enduring mystery in all of Hollywood, we turn now to Marilyn Monroe, who rests in crypt number 24 in the Corridor of Memories at Pierce Brothers Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery in Los Angeles. Monroe died on August 5, 1962, at the age of 36. The official ruling was probable death by acute barbiturate poisoning, but the word probable has kept conspiracy theorists busy for more than 60 years. Monroe's relationships with President John F. Kennedy and his brother Robert Kennedy are central to nearly every alternative theory. Some believe she was silenced because she knew too much about government secrets. Others point to the mafia, who may have wanted to use her connections to embarrass the Kennedys. Still others note the strange 6-hour gap between the estimated time of her death and when the police were called, during which her housekeeper reportedly did several loads of laundry. The theories are endless, and not one of them has ever been proven. What is proven is that her ex-husband, Joe DiMaggio, arranged the funeral and had red roses delivered to her crypt 3 times a week for 20 years. He never remarried, and his last words before dying in 1999 were reportedly, "I'll finally get to see Marilyn." Even in death, Monroe's resting place has been a source of bizarre controversy. Playboy founder Hugh Hefner purchased the crypt directly beside hers in 1992, paying $75,000 for the privilege. He was interred there after his death in 2017. The man who had owned the crypt directly above Monroe's for decades, a fellow named Richard Poncher, who had bought it from DiMaggio, left specific instructions that he be buried face down. His widow later confirmed the reason. Poncher told her that if she didn't bury him that way above Marilyn, he would haunt her for the rest of her life. She even tried to auction off his crypt in 2009 to pay her mortgage, and bidding reached $4.6 million before the deal fell through. So the arrangement persists to this day. Visitors leave lipstick kisses on Monroe's marker so frequently that the nameplate has to be periodically replaced due to oxidation from the cosmetics. Ghost hunters claim to hear soft crying near her crypt. Psychics say Monroe's spirit has told them her death was not intentional. The truth, whatever it is, went with her into that small marble chamber, and 60 years of digging has not pried it loose. Let's step away from Hollywood and travel deep into the Mississippi Delta to a crossroads where American music met American mythology, and neither one has been the same since. Robert Johnson was born in 1911 in Hazelhurst, Mississippi, and he is, by almost universal agreement, the most influential blues musician who ever lived. His recordings, just 29 songs laid down in 2 sessions in 1936 and 1937, transformed popular music. Songs like Crossroad Blues, Hellhound on My Trail, and Me and the Devil Blues would influence everyone from Muddy Waters to the Rolling Stones to Eric Clapton. But it's the legend surrounding Johnson that makes his story irresistible. According to a myth that took root almost immediately after his death, Johnson was a mediocre guitarist who disappeared for a period and returned with supernatural talent. The explanation? He had gone to a crossroads at midnight, met the devil, and traded his soul for the ability to play the blues like no one before or since. Johnson didn't discourage the story. His lyrics were full of references to the devil, to hellhounds, to dark bargains. Whether he believed it himself or simply recognized good marketing, we'll never know. Johnson died on August 16, 1938, at the age of 27, after drinking poisoned whiskey at a juke joint near Greenwood, Mississippi. The most widely accepted theory is that a jealous husband spiked his drink with strychnine. No death certificate was filed until decades later, no autopsy was performed, and no one is entirely sure where he's buried. There are 3 different graves in Mississippi that claim to hold Robert Johnson's remains, each with its own marker, each with its own defenders. One is at Little Zion Missionary Baptist Church near Greenwood. Another is at Mount Zion Missionary Baptist Church near Morgan City. A third marker stands at Payne Chapel near Quito. Researchers have argued for decades over which, if any, is the real site. The uncertainty feels almost poetic for a man whose entire life was steeped in mystery. Visitors to all 3 graves leave coins, guitar picks, and small bottles of whiskey. Whether the devil took Robert Johnson's soul is between them. What's certain is that the music Johnson left behind has outlasted any bargain. Speaking of bargains with the beyond, no one tested the boundary between life and death more publicly than Harry Houdini, the greatest escape artist the world has ever known, whose grave at Machpelah Cemetery in Glendale, Queens, is the site of perhaps the most famous supernatural tradition in American history. Houdini was born Eric Weiss in Budapest in 1874 and came to America as a child. He became the most famous performer of his era, a man who escaped from handcuffs, straitjackets, milk cans filled with water, and sealed coffins buried underground. But in the last years of his life, Houdini became equally famous for something else. His crusade against fraudulent spirit mediums who preyed on grieving families. He exposed their tricks, the hidden wires, the rigged tables, the cold readings, with the ruthlessness of a man who took deception personally. He had tried to contact his own late mother through mediums and found every one of them to be a fraud. Before Houdini died, he and his wife Bess made a pact. Whoever died first would attempt to send a secret coded message from beyond the grave. If a medium could produce the code, it would prove that communication with the dead was real. Houdini died on October 31, 1926, Halloween, at the age of 52, from peritonitis caused by a ruptured appendix. The circumstances were bizarre. A college student at McGill University in Montreal had asked Houdini whether it was true he could withstand any blow to the stomach, then punched him several times before Houdini could brace himself. Already suffering from a broken ankle, Houdini ignored the mounting pain and kept performing. By the time he reached Detroit, his appendix had ruptured and the infection had spread. He collapsed after a show and died a week later. For 10 years, Bess held seances on every Halloween, waiting for the secret code. It never came. In 1936, she held a final seance on the roof of the Hollywood Knickerbocker Hotel and declared, "10 years is long enough to wait for any man." But the tradition didn't die with her. Every Halloween, magicians and fans gather at Houdini's grave or at various locations around the country to hold seances in his honor. His grave itself has had a troubled history. The bronze bust on the monument was destroyed by vandals in 1975, and replacements were stolen or damaged until a permanent replica was installed in 2011 by a group calling themselves the Houdini Commandos. The bust is believed to be the only graven image in the entire Jewish cemetery, a special exception granted because of Houdini's unique place in American culture. The man who made his career escaping from every trap ever devised has yet to escape the one trap no one beats, but his fans keep asking. Staying on the theme of bodies that refuse to stay put, we turn to the most traveled corpse in presidential history, Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater on April 14, 1865, and was laid to rest in a magnificent tomb at Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield, Illinois. But what happened to his remains after that is a saga of attempted theft, secret hiding, and repeated relocation that reads like a Gothic novel. In 1876, 11 years after the assassination, a gang of counterfeiters attempted to steal Lincoln's body from his sarcophagus. Their plan was to hold the remains for ransom, $200,000, and the release of an imprisoned associate. Secret Service agents had infiltrated the gang and were waiting inside the tomb, but the operation nearly went sideways when an agent's gun misfired, and the thieves escaped into the night. They were tracked down and arrested days later. The attempted theft so alarmed Lincoln's friends and allies that they formed a secret group called the Lincoln Guard of Honor, which decided to hide the president's body. For the next several years, Lincoln's coffin was moved around inside the tomb, hidden in shallow graves between the walls, buried in the basement, and at one point concealed beneath a woodpile. Between 1865 and 1901, Lincoln's coffin was moved an estimated 17 times. When a new, more secure tomb was finally constructed in 1901, the decision was made to encase the coffin in a cage of steel and bury it under 10 feet of concrete so that no one could ever disturb it again. Before the concrete was poured, Lincoln's coffin was opened one final time so that a small group of witnesses could confirm the body was actually inside. A plumber's apprentice named Fleetwood Lindley, who was 13 years old at the time, was the last person to gaze upon Lincoln's face, 36 years after the assassination. Lindley lived until 1963. He reportedly said that Lincoln's features were still remarkably recognizable, though the suit had deteriorated and the skin had turned bronze. Visitors to the tomb today often rub the nose of a bronze bust of Lincoln near the entrance, a tradition that has polished the nose to a bright sheen. Ghost sightings at the tomb are common. Guards and visitors have reported hearing footsteps, muffled voices, and weeping. Lincoln's ghost has also been reported in the White House by Presidents Theodore Roosevelt and Dwight Eisenhower, and by First Lady Grace Coolidge, among others, making Lincoln the most frequently cited presidential ghost in American history. From a president whose body couldn't stay in one place, we cross the country to Hollywood and a silent film star whose body has never been alone. At Hollywood Forever Cemetery in Los Angeles, in the Cathedral Mausoleum, rests Rudolph Valentino, the first great screen heartthrob, the Latin lover who made women faint in theaters across America. Born Rodolfo Guglielmi in Italy in 1895, Valentino came to America as a young man and worked as a gardener, a dishwasher, and a taxi dancer before finding his way into the movies. His starring role in The Sheik in 1921 turned him into the biggest sex symbol of the silent era. He was 31 years old when he died on August 23, 1926, from complications of a perforated ulcer, and the national reaction was something America had never seen before. Over 100,000 people lined the streets of New York for his funeral. Riots broke out. Several fans reportedly took their own lives. And then, on the first anniversary of his death, something strange happened at the cemetery. A woman in black mourning clothes, her face hidden behind a veil, appeared at Valentino's crypt and placed a single red rose on the marble. She spoke to no one, and then she vanished. The mysterious Lady in Black returned every year, always on the anniversary, always with the red rose, always disappearing without a word. The media went wild. Who was she? A secret lover? A grieving fan? A studio publicity stunt? Over the years, as many as 17 different women were spotted in black veils at the crypt, some of them clearly imposters seeking attention. The identity of the original Lady in Black was eventually traced to Deetra Flame, a woman who, as a 14-year-old girl hospitalized with a serious illness, had been visited by Valentino, who was a family friend. He brought her a red rose, told her she would live many more years, and made her promise that if he died first, she would come visit him so he wouldn't be alone. Flame kept her promise for decades, stopping her visits in 1954 when the circus of competing ladies in black became too much. She returned quietly in 1977 and made her final visit in 1981. She died in 1984. But here's where the story slips from history into the uncanny. Since Flame's death, visitors and cemetery staff have reported seeing a spectral woman kneeling at Valentino's crypt, always accompanied by the scent of fresh roses. Some claim that fresh flowers appear in the wall vases near his crypt with no apparent source. Whether Deetra Flame is keeping her promise from beyond the grave is a question Hollywood forever leaves for its visitors to decide. From a death surrounded by roses to one surrounded by dark water and unanswered questions, we move to the case of Natalie Wood, one of the most beloved actresses of her generation, whose drowning off Catalina Island on November 29, 1981, remains one of Hollywood's most persistent mysteries. Wood was a star from childhood. She was 8 years old when she appeared in Miracle on 34th Street, and a teenager when Rebel Without a Cause made her famous alongside James Dean, whom we visited earlier in our journey. She went on to star in West Side Story, Splendor in the Grass, and Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice, earning 3 Academy Award nominations along the way. She was 43 when she drowned in the waters off Catalina Island during a weekend boat trip with her husband, actor Robert Wagner, and their friend, actor Christopher Walken. The official ruling at the time was accidental drowning, possibly while trying to secure a dinghy that had been banging against the hull of their yacht, the Splendor. Wood was known to have a lifelong intense fear of dark water, which made the circumstances all the more puzzling. In 2011, the captain of the Splendor, Dennis Davern, came forward to say he had lied to investigators in 1981 and that Wood and Wagner had been arguing violently that night before Wood went missing. The case was reopened. In 2012, the Los Angeles coroner changed Wood's cause of death from accidental drowning to drowning and other undetermined factors, noting unexplained bruises on her body. Wagner was named a person of interest in 2018 but was never charged. He has denied any involvement. The investigation remains technically open. Wood is buried at Westwood Village Memorial Park, just a short walk from Marilyn Monroe. Fans leave flowers at her grave, and some claim to have seen a woman in white standing near the marker on foggy mornings. Whether the truth about that night on the water will ever surface is a question that Catalina Island keeps asking the Pacific. A continent away from the California coast, in the old cobblestoned heart of Baltimore, Maryland, lies another grave wrapped in mystery, though this one belongs to a man who practically invented the genre. Edgar Allan Poe, the father of the modern detective story and the master of the macabre, died under circumstances almost as strange as any of his fiction. On October 3, 1849, Poe was found delirious on the streets of Baltimore, wearing clothes that were not his own. he was taken to Washington Medical College, where he drifted in and out of consciousness for 4 days, never coherent enough to explain what had happened to him. He died on October 7th, at the age of 40. The official cause of death was listed as congestion of the brain, a catch-all term of the era that meant almost nothing. Since then, more than 24 theories have been proposed: rabies, syphilis, cholera, alcohol poisoning, carbon monoxide poisoning, epilepsy, and even a theory that he was a victim of cooping, a practice in which gangs would kidnap people, drug them, and force them to vote repeatedly at different polling stations, which was common in Baltimore at the time. His medical records have been lost. No autopsy was performed. The mystery is permanent. Poe was buried at what is now Westminster Hall and Burying Ground, and for decades his grave was poorly maintained and nearly forgotten. In 1875, a campaign by schoolteachers and admirers raised enough money to move his remains to a more prominent spot and erect a proper monument. But in 2009, an unusual tradition came to an end. For over 50 years, a figure known as the Poe Toaster had appeared at the grave every January 19th, Poe's birthday, in the early morning hours. Dressed in a black coat and wide-brimmed hat, the toaster would leave 3 red roses and a half bottle of cognac on the gravestone, then disappear into the night. The tradition was witnessed by Poe enthusiasts who held vigils, though no one ever identified the visitor or fully understood the symbolism. After the toaster failed to appear for several consecutive years, starting around 2010, the tradition was declared over, and attempts to establish a new toaster through a competition have never quite recaptured the original mystique. The cemetery itself is said to be one of the most haunted in America, which seems fitting. Poe would probably approve. Speaking of the macabre, let's follow the thread from one dark legend to another by stepping from Poe's Baltimore to the story of a woman whose name is synonymous with American horror, Lizzie Borden. Lizzie Borden took an axe, gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, gave her father 41. That schoolyard rhyme has been chanted by generations of American children, and it is, of course, almost entirely wrong about the facts. On August 4, 1892, Andrew Borden and his wife Abby were found hacked to death in their home in Fall River, Massachusetts. Andrew had been struck 10 or 11 times with a hatchet, Abby about 18 or 19. Their daughter Lizzie was the prime suspect, arrested and charged with both murders. The trial that followed in June 1893 was a national sensation, the O.J. Simpson trial of its era, and the result was the same: acquittal. The jury deliberated for less than 90 minutes. No one else was ever charged. Lizzie Borden lived the rest of her life in Fall River, shunned by polite society but financially comfortable thanks to her inheritance. She died in 1927 at the age of 66, of pneumonia, and was buried at Oak Grove Cemetery alongside her father, her stepmother, and her sister Emma, who had died 9 days earlier. The proximity of the deaths, Lizzie and Emma dying within days of each other after years of estrangement, added one final whisper of mystery to the story. The Borden house in Fall River is now a bed and breakfast, and guests frequently report hearing the sounds of a woman weeping, doors opening and closing on their own, and shadowy figures in the upstairs bedrooms. The grave, by contrast, is quiet. Whatever Lizzie knew, and whatever she did or didn't do on that sweltering August morning, she took it with her to Oak Grove, where the stone says nothing about axes at all. From axes to bullets, from Fall River to Los Angeles, we turn to one of the strangest unsolved cases in Hollywood history. George Reeves was Superman. From 1952 to 1958, he starred in the television series Adventures of Superman, becoming one of the most recognizable faces in America. Children adored him. Adults admired his square-jawed, all-American decency. And then, on June 16, 1959, at the age of 45, Reeves was found dead in the bedroom of his Benedict Canyon home with a single gunshot wound to the head. A pistol was found near his body. The death was ruled a probable act by his own hand, but almost nobody who knew him believed it. There were guests in the house that night: his fiancée, Lenore Lemon, and 2 friends. who gave conflicting and suspicious accounts of what happened. Lemon reportedly told the other guests, after hearing Reeves go upstairs, he's going to shoot himself before the gunshot was fired. The spent shell casing was found under Reeves' body, which would have been unusual for a self-inflicted wound. There were bruises on his body consistent with a struggle. No fingerprints were found on the gun, as if it had been wiped clean. And the police investigation was, by all accounts, cursory at best. Rumors swirled for decades that Reeves had been murdered, possibly by a jealous lover or the lover's powerful husband. The 2006 film Hollywoodland, starring Ben Affleck as Reeves, explored the various theories without settling on one. Reeves was cremated and his ashes were placed in a niche at the Pasadena Mausoleum, later moved to Mountain View Cemetery in Altadena, California. Some Superman fans still visit the site, though it's not widely publicized. The man who was bulletproof on screen was anything but in life, and the question of who pulled the trigger, or whether Reeves himself did, has never been definitively answered. From one celebrity death shrouded in doubt to another with a built-in punchline, let's head to Martha's Vineyard, where John Belushi, the electric, unpredictable force behind Saturday Night Live and Animal House, is buried in Abel's Hill Cemetery. Belushi died on March 5, 1982, at the age of 33, of a combined drug overdose at the Chateau Marmont Hotel in Los Angeles. His death was a shock, but perhaps not a surprise to those who knew his habits. He was buried on Martha's Vineyard, where he had a home and where he had spent some of his happiest times. But here's the twist. The headstone that fans visit, the one with his name and the inscription that has become famous in its own right, may not be where Belushi actually rests. After rowdy fans turned the gravesite into a party destination, leaving empty beer cans, blaring music, and trampling neighboring graves, his wife, Judy, reportedly had his remains quietly moved to an unmarked location elsewhere in the same cemetery. The original headstone remains, and fans still pay their respects there. But local legend holds that Belushi's actual bones are somewhere else entirely, known only to his family. It's the kind of post-mortem gag Belushi himself might have appreciated. The fans think they're visiting him, but the real John is somewhere else, finally getting a little peace and quiet. From comedy to tragedy, from the Vineyard to Hong Kong by way of Seattle, we come to the story of Bruce Lee, and the curse that some believe followed his family across generations. Lee was the most influential martial artist in history, a man who single-handedly transformed how the West understood Asian fighting arts through films like Enter the Dragon and Fists of Fury. He died on July 20, 1973 in Hong Kong at the age of 32. The official cause was cerebral edema, swelling of the brain, triggered by an allergic reaction to a painkiller called Equagesic. But the circumstances were odd. Lee had collapsed earlier that year on the set of Enter the Dragon with similar symptoms, and he was found unconscious in the apartment of Taiwanese actress Betty Ting Pei, which raised eyebrows. Almost immediately, theories proliferated. Some blamed the Chinese triads. Others pointed to a secret martial arts technique called the dim mak, or death touch, supposedly administered by a rival fighter. Still others whispered about a family curse. That last theory gained traction 20 years later when Bruce Lee's son, Brandon, was killed on March 31, 1993, during the filming of The Crow, when a prop gun loaded with improperly made dummy rounds fired a real projectile into his abdomen. He was 28. The eerie parallels, father and son, both dying young and under unusual circumstances, both at the peak of their careers, were too much for the public to ignore. Talk of a Lee family curse became widespread. Bruce Lee is buried at Lot 276 of Lakeview Cemetery in Seattle, and Brandon was laid to rest beside him after his death. Fans from around the world visit the twin graves, and the site has become one of the most visited in the Pacific Northwest. Whether you believe in curses or coincidence, there is something undeniably poignant about a father and son, reunited on a hillside overlooking a city neither one was born in, both gone before their time. From a legacy cut short to one that was simply cut, we move to one of the most disturbing unsolved murders in Hollywood's golden age. Bob Crane was best known as Colonel Hogan on the hit television series Hogan's Heroes, which ran from 1965 to 1971. Crane was charming, funny, and wildly popular. He was also, as it emerged after his death, deeply involved in a secret life of recording his own sexual encounters on video, a practice that was shocking in the late 1970s and remains unsettling today. On June 29, 1978, Crane was found bludgeoned to death in his apartment in Scottsdale, Arizona, where he was performing in a dinner theater production. He had been struck in the head with a blunt object, and an electrical cord had been tied around his neck. He was 49. The prime suspect was John Henry Carpenter, a video equipment salesman and Crane's frequent companion in his after-hours activities. Carpenter had been in Scottsdale visiting Crane at the time of the murder, and traces of what appeared to be brain tissue were found in Carpenter's rental car. He was charged in 1994, 16 years after the murder, but was acquitted. The evidence had degraded too badly. Carpenter died in 1998, still protesting his innocence. No one else has ever been charged. Crane is buried at Westwood Village Memorial Park, just a stone's throw from Marilyn Monroe and Natalie Wood. His grave is modest and rarely visited compared to theirs. The mystery of who killed Colonel Hogan remains officially open. From one performer denied justice to another denied even a headstone, we travel to the story of Bessie Smith, the Empress of the Blues. Smith was the highest-paid black entertainer in America during the 1920s, a powerhouse vocalist who recorded with Louis Armstrong and influenced every blues and jazz singer who came after her. She sold millions of records and could fill any theater in the country. But when she died on September 26, 1937, at the age of 43, after a car accident on a dark Mississippi highway, she was buried in an unmarked grave at Mount Lawn Cemetery in Sharon Hill, Pennsylvania. Her husband, Jack G., collected money from friends and fans for a headstone but spent it on himself instead. The grave sat unmarked for 33 years. In 1970, two women came together to right this wrong. Singer Janis Joplin, who idolized Smith and credited her as a major influence, and Juanita Green, a nurse who had been one of Smith's neighbors. They split the cost of a proper headstone. For decades, a false story circulated that Smith had bled to death because a white hospital refused to admit her, a story that was dramatized by Edward Albee in his 1959 play, The Death of Bessie Smith. The truth is more prosaic, but no less tragic. The accident was severe, her injuries were catastrophic, and she died at a black hospital in Clarksdale, Mississippi, despite the doctor's best efforts. The false story, however, served a larger truth about the reality of segregation in 1937 Mississippi, which may be why it persisted so long. From one legendary voice silenced too soon, let's follow the thread of mysterious music deaths to another, Sam Cooke, the man they called the King of Soul. Cooke was the singer who bridged gospel and pop music, who gave the world You Send Me, A Change Is Gonna Come, and Wonderful World, and whose voice was so pure and effortless that it made other singers sound like they were trying too hard. He was also a sharp businessman, one of the first black artists to own his own record label and publishing company. On December 11, 1964, Cooke was shot and killed at the Hacienda Motel in Los Angeles by the motel's manager, Bertha Franklin. He was 33. The official story was that Cooke had brought a young woman named Elisa Boyer to the motel, that Boyer fled the room with most of Cooke's clothes while he was in the bathroom, and that Cooke, enraged and barely dressed, broke into the manager's office looking for her, at which point Franklin shot him in self-defense. The ruling was justifiable homicide. But almost nothing about the story sat right with the people who knew Cooke. Singer Etta James, who viewed his body at the funeral, said his injuries were far more severe than a single gunshot would explain. His family and friends pointed to inconsistencies in Boyer's and Franklin's accounts. Some suspected that Cooke's business interests, particularly his efforts to gain financial independence from the white-controlled music industry, had made him a target. Others pointed to his involvement in the civil rights movement, "A Change Is Gonna Come" had become an anthem of the struggle, and Cook had been increasingly outspoken. No alternative theory has ever been proven, but the questions have never gone away. Cook is buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California. His grave is visited by musicians and fans who recognize that the voice America lost that night at the Hacienda Motel was one it would never hear again. Speaking of violent ends and persistent mysteries, let's make a detour to the darker side of American ambition and visit the grave of Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, the mobster who built Las Vegas. Siegel was a founding member of Murder, Inc., the enforcement arm of the National Crime Syndicate, and one of the most feared gangsters of the 1930s and 1940s. But his lasting legacy was the Flamingo Hotel, the first luxury casino resort on the Las Vegas Strip, which he envisioned and drove to completion in 1946 using money from his mafia associates, far more money than he had promised it would cost. On June 20th, 1947, Siegel was sitting in the living room of his girlfriend Virginia Hill's Beverly Hills mansion when someone fired a rifle through the window. One of the bullets struck him in the head, killing him instantly. He was 41. No one was ever arrested for the murder, though it was widely assumed to be a mob hit ordered because Siegel had skimmed funds from the Flamingo's construction. The speed with which his associates moved in on the Flamingo, they were running the casino within minutes of Siegel's death, according to some accounts, only reinforced the theory. Siegel is buried at Hollywood Forever Cemetery, just a short distance from Rudolph Valentino, in a mausoleum section that also houses the remains of several other notable figures. The man who dreamed up the modern Las Vegas was killed before he could enjoy it, and the desert empire he created never acknowledged him. For decades, the city pretended Bugsy Siegel had never existed. From a gangster who couldn't escape the mob to a pair of outlaws who couldn't escape the law, we turn to Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, whose 2-year crime spree across the Depression-era South ended in a hail of bullets on a Louisiana back road on May 23, 1934. The ambush, led by former Texas Ranger Frank Hamer, pumped approximately 130 rounds into their stolen Ford V8 sedan. Bonnie was 23, Clyde was 25. The death car became an instant tourist attraction. The undertaker in Arcadia, Louisiana, charged admission to view the bodies, and the two outlaws became folk heroes almost overnight. But here's the part of the story most people don't know. Bonnie and Clyde wanted to be buried together. They had asked for it. Their families refused. Clyde was buried at Western Heights Cemetery in Dallas, while Bonnie was buried at Fish Trap Cemetery, later moved to Crown Hill Memorial Park, also in Dallas. They rest roughly 12 miles apart, close enough to share a city, far enough apart to satisfy their families' wishes that the two be separated in death as they should have been in life. Bonnie's mother reportedly said, "She had her in life. I wanted her in death." Clyde's grave draws the more adventurous visitors, some of whom have chipped away at the headstone for souvenirs over the decades, requiring multiple restorations. Bonnie's is quieter, often adorned with flowers from strangers who feel that the girl from Rowena, Texas, was more victim than villain. Whether they were desperate lovers caught in impossible times or cold-blooded killers who chose their path, Bonnie and Clyde remain inseparable in legend, even though their graves tell a different story. Let's stay in Hollywood's shadowy past for our next stop because the death of Thelma Todd, known to fans as Hot Toddy, is one of the strangest and most debated in Tinseltown history. Todd was a beautiful, vivacious comedic actress who starred opposite the Marx Brothers in Monkey Business and Horse Feathers and appeared with Laurel and Hardy in multiple shorts. She was 30 years old when she was found dead on December 16, 1935. Slumped over the steering wheel of her chocolate-brown Lincoln Phaeton in the garage of her Pacific Palisades home. The cause of death was carbon monoxide poisoning. The question was how it happened. The grand jury ruled it accidental, but the evidence was a mess of contradictions. Todd had been at a party at the Trocadero nightclub the night before and was seen alive in the early morning hours. Her ex-husband, Pat DeSico, had mob ties. Her business partner, director Roland West, admitted he had locked her out of their shared apartment that night after an argument. Lucky Luciano, the most powerful mob boss in America, had reportedly been pressuring Todd to let him use her restaurant as a front for illegal gambling. She had refused. Take your pick of suspects. West confessed on his deathbed in 1952 that he was responsible for Todd's death, though the nature of his involvement, whether he caused it or merely facilitated it by locking her out on a cold night, remains unclear. Todd is buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California, among hundreds of Hollywood luminaries. The case has never been officially solved, and Hot Toddy's death remains one of the coldest cold cases in a city that specializes in them. Another Hollywood mystery from the silent era takes us even further back in time, to the murder of William Desmond Taylor, the most prominent film director in America in the early 1920s. On the morning of February 2, 1922, Taylor was found shot to death in his Los Angeles bungalow. He was 49. The investigation was a disaster from the start. Paramount Studios executives arrived at the scene before police and were seen removing documents and personal items. The suspects were numerous and colorful. Mabel Normand, one of the biggest comedic stars of the era, had been the last person known to see Taylor alive. Mary Miles Minter, a teenage actress widely rumored to be in love with Taylor, had monogrammed nightgowns found in his apartment. Taylor's former valet, Edward Sands, had embezzled from him and vanished. And Taylor himself was hiding secrets. He had abandoned a wife and daughter on the East Coast years earlier and was living under a false name. The case was never solved. Taylor was cremated and his ashes were interred at Hollywood Forever Cemetery. The murder torpedoed the careers of both Normand and Minter and contributed to the wave of scandals that led Hollywood to impose its own moral code. More than a century later, amateur sleuths and professional historians are still picking at the case, and the most recent serious investigation, published in 2012, pointed to Minter's domineering stage mother, Charlotte Shelby, as the most likely killer. Shelby was never charged and died in 1957, taking whatever she knew to Forest Lawn. Continuing our journey through America's most haunted history, let's turn to a name that doesn't belong to any famous person at all, or rather, belongs to a woman no one could identify. Elizabeth Short was a 22-year-old aspiring actress whose mutilated body was found in a vacant lot in Los Angeles on January 15, 1947. The case became known as the Black Dahlia murder, and it is arguably the most famous unsolved homicide in American history. Short's body had been bisected at the waist, drained of blood, and posed with her arms raised above her head. The killer sent taunting letters to the press. Over 60 people confessed to the murder over the decades, and investigators pursued more than 150 suspects. None were ever charged. Short was buried at Mountain View Cemetery in Oakland, California, after her mother arranged for the body to be transported from Los Angeles. Her grave was unmarked for years, which seems appropriate for a woman whose identity was stolen from her in more ways than one. The press gave her the nickname Black Dahlia after her death, and the persona has eclipsed the real Elizabeth Short ever since. A headstone was eventually placed, and visitors come to pay respects to a young woman whose death became a media spectacle, and whose killer was never brought to justice. The case remains open. From an unidentified killer in 1947, let's jump to an identified one. Or was he? And the most controversial exhumation in American history. Jesse James, the infamous outlaw of the post-Civil War era, was supposedly shot and killed on April 3, 1882, by Robert Ford, a member of his own gang, who fired a bullet into the back of James's head while he stood on a chair to dust a picture. Ford collected the reward money, and James was buried at the family farm in Kearney, Missouri. But almost immediately, rumors began circulating that the man Ford killed was not really Jesse James, that the real Jesse had staged his death and slipped away, living under an assumed name for decades. These rumors were persistent enough that in 1995, James's remains were exhumed from his grave at Mount Olivet Cemetery in Kearney, where they had been moved in 1902. DNA testing confirmed that the remains were consistent with the James family line, though the results were not conclusive enough to silence all skeptics. At least two other men, J. Frank Dalton and John James, came forward in the 20th century claiming to be the real Jesse James. Dalton, who made his claim in 1948, was exhumed in 2000, and his DNA did not match. The story of Jesse James's death, like the man himself, refuses to lie still. From the American frontier to the Argentine political stage, we travel to one of the most extraordinary posthumous odysseys in modern history. Eva Perón, Evita, was the First Lady of Argentina and the most powerful woman in South American politics when she died of cervical cancer on July 26, 1952, at the age of 33. What happened to her body after that is almost beyond belief. Her husband, President Juan Perón, had her corpse embalmed by a Spanish pathologist named Dr. Pedro Ara, who spent over a year creating what amounted to a wax-like preservation so perfect that Eva appeared to be sleeping. A monument was planned. But when a military coup ousted Perón in 1955, the new government seized Eva's body, terrified that it would become a rallying point for her supporters. What followed was a 2-decade journey that took her embalmed corpse from military bases to the back of a bread van to a secret burial under a false name in Milan, Italy. Perón's supporters searched for her body for years. It was finally returned to Juan Perón in exile in Spain in 1971. When Perón returned to power in Argentina briefly before his own death in 1974, Eva's body came with him. She was eventually interred in the Duarte family crypt at La Recoleta Cemetery in Buenos Aires, where she rests today behind steel plates and in a vault designed to withstand a nuclear blast. The security is deliberate. No one is ever going to steal Eva Perón's body again. La Recoleta is one of the most visited cemeteries in the world, and Evita's tomb is its main attraction, drawing hundreds of thousands of visitors each year. Fresh flowers are always present. But Recoleta has another, eerier legend. The ghost of a young woman named Rufina Cambaceres, who died in 1902 and was supposedly buried alive. Cemetery workers reportedly heard screaming from her tomb days after her funeral and found scratch marks inside the coffin when it was opened. Her ornate tomb, featuring a life-size statue of a young woman reaching for a door, stands as one of the most haunting monuments in the cemetery. Back on American soil, we turn to an exhumation driven not by family dispute, but by conspiracy theory. Lee Harvey Oswald, the man officially held responsible for the assassination of President John F. Kennedy on November 22, 1963, was shot and killed 2 days later by nightclub owner Jack Ruby in one of the first murders broadcast live on national television. Oswald was buried at Rose Hill Memorial Park in Fort Worth, Texas. Almost immediately, theories began to circulate that the man in the coffin was not actually Oswald, that a Soviet imposter had taken his place years earlier, and the real Oswald was either dead or living in the Soviet Union. The theory gained enough traction that in 1981, British author Michael Eddowes successfully petitioned to have the grave opened. Oswald's widow, Marina, also consented, hoping to put the rumors to rest. When the coffin was opened, pathologists confirmed through dental records that the remains were indeed Oswald's. At least one conspiracy theory was laid to rest that day, though hundreds of others about the Kennedy assassination continue to thrive. Oswald's headstone has been stolen at least once, and the grave has been the target of vandalism over the years. It is among the most visited and most controversial burial sites in Texas. Speaking of men who vanished, there is no grave at all for our next subject, and that is precisely what makes him fascinating. D.B. Cooper is the pseudonym used by an unidentified man who, on November 24, 1971, hijacked a Northwest Orient Airlines flight from Portland to Seattle, extorted $200,000 in ransom, and then parachuted out of the back of the plane into a rainy night over the Pacific Northwest. He was never seen again. No body was ever found. No confirmed trace of the man has ever surfaced, though a small bundle of deteriorating $20 bills matching the ransom serial numbers was discovered by a boy along the Columbia River in 1980. The FBI investigated the case for 45 years before officially closing it in 2016, making it the only unsolved hijacking in American aviation history. Without a body, there is no grave. Without a grave, there is no closure. D.B. Cooper exists entirely in the space between fact and myth, a man who stepped out of an airplane and into American folklore. From a man who vanished into the American sky to one who seemingly couldn't be killed, we crossed the Atlantic for one of history's most terrifying death stories. Grigory Rasputin, the self-proclaimed holy man who held enormous influence over the Russian royal family in the years before the revolution, has become the subject of perhaps the most famous death legend in the world. On December 30th, 1916, a group of Russian nobles led by Prince Felix Yusupov lured Rasputin to the Yusupov Palace in St. Petersburg and attempted to murder him. According to the widely told but historically disputed account, they first fed him cakes and wine laced with cyanide, which had no effect. They then shot him in the chest. He fell, but rose again. They shot him again. He staggered into the courtyard. They shot him a third time and beat him with a rubber truncheon. Finally, they wrapped his body in cloth, drove him to the frozen Neva River, and pushed him through a hole in the ice. When his body was recovered days later, the autopsy reportedly showed water in his lungs, suggesting he was still alive when he went into the river. Modern historians have questioned many details of this account. Yusupov told the story multiple times and changed it with each telling. But the legend has only grown stronger. Rasputin was 52, or possibly 47, his birth year is disputed. His body was initially buried on the grounds of the imperial palace, but was dug up and burned by soldiers after the revolution. There is no grave to visit. His remains exist only as ash scattered somewhere in the Russian countryside. But the legend of the man who wouldn't die has itself proven immortal. From a death that was all too public to a disappearance that mystified the world, we turn to the queen of mystery fiction, Agatha Christie. In December 1926, Christie, already famous as the author of The Mysterious Affair at Styles and The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, vanished from her home in Berkshire, England. Her abandoned car was found the next morning near a chalk quarry with the headlights on and her belongings inside. A massive search was launched, involving over 1,000 police officers, 15,000 volunteers, and even fellow mystery writers like Arthur Conan Doyle, who took a personal interest. 11 days later, Christie was found alive at a hotel in Harrogate, Yorkshire, where she had registered under the name of her husband's mistress. She claimed to have no memory of the preceding days. Her husband Archie had recently asked for a divorce so he could marry his mistress, and theories about Christie's disappearance have ranged from a nervous breakdown to a calculated publicity stunt to a genuine case of amnesia triggered by emotional trauma. Christie never explained what happened, and her autobiography, published after her death in 1976, skips the entire episode. She lived to 85, becoming the best-selling fiction writer of all time, with an estimated 2 billion copies of her books in print. She is buried at St. Mary's Churchyard in Cholsey, Oxfordshire, in a quiet plot that gives no hint of the drama that once surrounded her name. The disappearance remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the 20th century, a real-life whodunit from the woman who invented the genre. Returning to Los Angeles, we come to the grave of Sal Mineo, the dark-eyed young actor who earned 2 Academy Award nominations before he was 30. Mineo was just 16 when he starred alongside James Dean, another name from our journey, in Rebel Without a Cause, earning his first Oscar nomination. He received a second for his role in Exodus alongside Paul Newman. But as the 1960s turned into the 1970s, Mineo's career faded. He continued to work in theater and took roles that explored his identity as a gay man, which was still taboo in Hollywood at the time. On February 12, 1976, Mineo was stabbed to death in the alley behind his West Hollywood apartment. He was 37. The killing appeared random. Mineo was returning home from a rehearsal. But for 2 years, the case went unsolved, and rumors flew that his death was connected to his personal life or to the drug culture of the era. In 1978, a pizza delivery man named Lionel Ray Williams was arrested after bragging to a cellmate about the killing during an unrelated prison stint. Williams, who had no connection to Mineo and apparently chose him at random, was convicted of murder. Mineo is buried at Gate of Heaven Cemetery in Hawthorne, New York. His grave is modest, a quiet resting place for a man whose early brilliance was matched only by the tragedy of his end. From one suspicious death to another shrouded in secrecy, we turn to the case of Dorothy Kilgallen, the nationally syndicated newspaper columnist and television personality who was found dead in her New York City townhouse on November 8, 1965, at the age of 52. Kilgallen was a fixture of American media. She appeared on the television panel show What's My Line for 16 years and was one of the most read columnists in the country. But what made her death controversial was its timing. Kilgallen had been investigating the assassination of President Kennedy with an intensity that alarmed people in powerful positions. She was the only journalist to obtain a private interview with Jack Ruby, Oswald's killer, and she told friends she was about to break the case wide open. The official cause of death was a combination of alcohol and barbiturates. Her death was ruled accidental. But the circumstances were strange. She was found fully dressed and sitting upright in a bed she never used, in a room she never slept in, with a book she had already finished reading placed open beside her. Her JFK research notes were never found. No meaningful investigation was conducted. Friends and colleagues spent decades arguing that Kilgallen was murdered to prevent her from publishing what she knew. No evidence has ever surfaced to prove this, but no evidence has surfaced to explain the anomalies in her death scene either. She is buried at Gate of Heaven Cemetery in Hawthorne, New York, the same cemetery where Sal Mineo rests. 2 mysteries, 1 graveyard. Let us shift gears now from conspiracy to the genuinely supernatural, or at least to a ghost story that has persisted for decades. Clifton Webb was one of the most elegant and acerbic actors of Hollywood's golden age, known for his roles in Laura, The Razor's Edge, and the Cheaper by the Dozen films. He was a lifelong bachelor, deeply devoted to his mother, May Bell, and terrified, absolutely terrified, of death. Webb made no secret of his belief in the afterlife and his determination to stick around after he died. He got his wish, apparently. Webb died of a heart attack on October 13, 1966, at the age of 76, and was entombed at Hollywood Forever Cemetery. Since then, his crypt has become one of the most actively haunted locations in the cemetery. Staff and visitors have reported cold spots, strange noises, and the sound of a man's voice in the corridor near his resting place. Some claim to have seen a spectral figure in a suit near the crypt. Whether these reports are genuine encounters or the product of Webb's own carefully cultivated reputation as a man who refused to leave is a question that Hollywood Forever, wisely, does not try to answer. Not far from Webb, another spirit is said to linger at Hollywood Forever, and this one belongs to the girl who followed the yellow brick road. Judy Garland, the luminous tragic star of The Wizard of Oz, Meet Me in St. Louis, and A Star is Born, was reinterred at Hollywood Forever Cemetery in January 2017, nearly 50 years after her death. Garland had originally been buried at Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, New York, but her daughter Liza Minnelli oversaw the transfer to a newly constructed mausoleum in Hollywood, where her mother had achieved her greatest fame. Garland died on June 22, 1969, in London, at the age of 47, from an accidental overdose of barbiturates. Her life had been a long battle against the studio system that had exploited her since childhood. MGM put her on diet pills at 13, amphetamines to keep her working, and sedatives to make her sleep. And the demons that followed her off-screen were the dark mirror of the joy she projected on it. Since her remains arrived at Hollywood Forever, visitors and staff have reported ghostly activity near her crypt. The faint sound of singing, a flicker of light where there should be none, and an overwhelming sense of sadness that seems to hang in the air. Whether the spirit of Judy Garland has truly come home. or whether grief itself leaves a kind of residue that sensitive people can feel, the reports persist. Fans leave flowers, ruby-red slippers, and handwritten notes at her resting place. The girl from Grand Rapids, Minnesota, who sang "Over the Rainbow" and made the whole world cry, may still be looking for a place where she truly belongs. From Hollywood forever, let's cross the Atlantic to the most visited grave in one of the most haunted cemeteries in the world. At Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris, among the graves of Chopin, Oscar Wilde, Edith Piaf, and an estimated 300,000 others, lies Jim Morrison, the charismatic, self-destructive frontman of The Doors. Morrison was one of the defining figures of the 1960s counterculture, a poet, a provocateur, and a rock star whose voice and presence were unlike anything that had come before. He moved to Paris in 1971, partly to escape legal troubles in the United States and partly to devote himself to writing. On July 3, 1971, he was found dead in the bathtub of his apartment on the Rue Beautreillis. He was 27. No autopsy was performed. French law at the time did not require one if a doctor could certify the cause of death, and the doctor attributed it to heart failure. Morrison's girlfriend, Pamela Corson, was the only person to see the body before the authorities arrived. The lack of an autopsy has fueled decades of speculation. Some believe Morrison died of a heroin overdose, possibly taken unknowingly. Others claim he is alive and faked his death, much like Elvis. A persistent theory holds that Morrison actually died at a Paris nightclub and was moved back to his apartment to avoid scandal. Whatever the truth, his grave at Père Lachaise has become one of the most famous in the world. For years, fans covered it with graffiti, left bottles of whiskey, and held impromptu parties that drove the neighboring grave occupants' families to distraction. A barrier was eventually installed to protect the site. Cemetery visitors and workers have reported seeing Morrison's ghost wandering among the tombstones, a tall, spectral figure in a leather jacket, pacing as if looking for something. A few claim to have seen him sitting on his own grave. Morrison would probably have liked that. From a ghost who won't leave to a filmmaker whose remains weren't left in peace, we come to F.W. Murnau, the great German director who gave the world Nosferatu, the first and arguably finest vampire film ever made. Murnau died in a car accident in 1931 near Santa Barbara, California, at the age of 42, just a week before the premiere of his final film, Taboo. He was buried at Südwestkirchhof Stahnsdorf, a sprawling cemetery on the outskirts of Berlin. In July 2015, a groundskeeper discovered that Murnau's grave had been disturbed and his coffin broken into. His skull had been stolen. Wax residue found at the scene suggested the theft may have been connected to an occult ritual. The skull has never been recovered. The irony was lost on no one. The man who created the most iconic vampire in cinema history had his own grave robbed in what appeared to be a dark ceremony. The theft sparked an international outcry and raised serious questions about cemetery security in Germany. Murnau's surviving remains have been secured, but the missing skull remains, as it were, at large. From the theft of a filmmaker's skull to the crushing of a man's body under stones, we travel to one of the most harrowing episodes in American history. In the Howard Street Cemetery in Salem, Massachusetts, lies a memorial to Giles Corey, an 81-year-old farmer who was accused of witchcraft during the Salem witch trials of 1692. Corey refused to enter a plea, which under the laws of the time meant he could not be tried. The authorities responded with a practice called peine forte et dure, pressing, in which heavy stones were gradually piled on the accused's chest to force a plea. Corey endured 2 days of this torture. According to witnesses, his only words were a defiant demand for more weight. He died on September 19, 1692, 3 days before his wife Martha was hanged as a witch. Legend holds that with his dying breath, Corey placed a curse on the town of Salem and its sheriffs. Whether you believe in curses or not, the record is worth noting. Multiple sheriffs of Salem have reportedly died in office or suffered heart attacks, and the town experienced a devastating fire in 1914 that some attributed to Corey's malediction. His ghost is said to appear in the Howard Street Cemetery before major disasters strike the town. The Salem witch trials lasted less than a year and claimed the lives of 20 people, but the story of Giles Corey, a man who chose death by crushing rather than submit to a rigged court, endures as one of the most powerful acts of defiance in the American story. From the horrors of Salem to the scandals of early Hollywood, we turn to a case that destroyed one of the biggest comedy careers of the silent era. In September 1921, a young actress named Virginia Rappe fell gravely ill during a party at the St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco, hosted by Roscoe "Fatty" Arbuckle, the most popular comedian in the world at the time. Rappe died of peritonitis caused by a ruptured bladder 4 days later. Arbuckle was charged with manslaughter. The press, led by William Randolph Hearst's newspapers, portrayed Arbuckle as a monster. The lurid stories were almost entirely fabricated. Arbuckle was tried 3 times. The first 2 trials ended in hung juries, and the third ended in acquittal, with the jury taking the extraordinary step of issuing a formal apology to Arbuckle, stating that there was not enough evidence to bring the case to trial in the first place. It didn't matter. Arbuckle's career was destroyed. He was banned from appearing on screen for over a decade. He died of heart failure in 1933 at the age of 46, on the very day he signed a new contract with Warner Brothers to star in a feature film, his first in years. Rappe is buried at Hollywood Forever Cemetery, where a modest marker commemorates a young woman whose death, whatever its true cause, was exploited beyond recognition. Arbuckle was cremated, and his ashes were scattered in the Pacific Ocean. He has no grave to visit, which may be the final injustice in a life full of them. Speaking of early Hollywood deaths that still provoke debate, the case of Thomas Ince is one that involves the most powerful media magnate in America, a yacht, and a bullet that may or may not have been fired. Thomas Ince was a pioneering film producer and director who was sometimes called the father of the Western. On November 19, 1924, Ince boarded the yacht Oneida, owned by newspaper baron William Randolph Hearst, for a birthday cruise with a small group of guests that included Charlie Chaplin, columnist Luella Parsons, and actress Marion Davies, who was Hearst's longtime mistress. What happened on that yacht has been debated for a century. The official story is that Ince fell ill with acute indigestion and was taken ashore, dying at home 2 days later of heart failure. He was 42. But rumors swirled that Hearst had shot Ince, possibly after catching Chaplin in a compromising position with Davies and firing at the wrong man. No autopsy was performed. Ince was cremated almost immediately, and Hearst's newspapers buried the story. Luella Parsons, a relatively minor columnist before the cruise, mysteriously received a lifetime contract with Hearst's media empire shortly afterward, fueling suspicion that she had been paid for her silence. Ince's ashes were interred at Hollywood Forever Cemetery. No criminal charges were ever filed, and the case remains officially closed. The 2001 film The Cat's Meow, starring Kirsten Dunst and Edward Herrmann, dramatized the theory that Hearst killed Ince. Whether it's true or not, the story perfectly encapsulates the axiom that in old Hollywood, the powerful could get away with literally anything. From Hollywood's dark side, let's cross the country and step into the White House, where the 12th President of the United States lies at the center of one of the most unusual conspiracy theories in American political history. Zachary Taylor, the hero of the Mexican-American War, died on July 9, 1850, just 16 months into his presidency. The official cause was acute gastroenteritis, brought on, it was said, by consuming large quantities of raw cherries and iced milk on a sweltering 4th of July. But for over a century, historians wondered whether Taylor had actually been poisoned. Taylor had been a moderate on slavery, opposing its expansion into the new Western territories, which put him at odds with powerful pro-slavery senators. In 1991, author Clara Rising convinced Taylor's descendants to allow his body to be exhumed from its crypt at the Zachary Taylor National Cemetery in Louisville, Kentucky. Forensic tests were conducted on his hair and fingernails, looking for evidence of arsenic. The results were negative. Taylor had died of natural causes. bad cherries, and worse luck. But the exhumation itself was a historic event, one of only a handful of times a president's body has been disturbed. Taylor was returned to his resting place, and the conspiracy theory, while not entirely silenced, lost most of its steam. From a president whose death was merely suspicious to an explorer whose death has been debated for over 2 centuries, we turn to Meriwether Lewis, one half of the famous Lewis and Clark expedition that crossed the continent in 1804 to 1806. Lewis died on October 11, 1809, at Grinder's Stand, a rural inn on the Natchez Trace in Tennessee. He was 35. The circumstances were violent. Lewis was found with gunshot wounds to the head and chest, and he lingered for several hours before dying. The death was ruled an act by his own hand, and that verdict was accepted for more than a century. But not everyone agreed, and the debate has intensified over time. Lewis was carrying important government documents, a significant amount of cash, and was on his way to Washington to settle disputed expense claims from his time as governor of the Louisiana Territory. Some historians argue that the evidence points to murder, possibly by robbers, possibly by someone who wanted the documents he was carrying. A request to exhume Lewis's body and perform a forensic examination has been filed with the National Park Service multiple times since the 1990s. Each time, the request has been denied. Lewis is buried at the site of Grinder's Stand, now part of the Natchez Trace Parkway, marked by a broken column memorial symbolizing a life cut short. The question of whether Meriwether Lewis died by his own hand or someone else's remains one of the oldest unsolved controversies in American history. Speaking of bodies that sparked identification controversies, the death and the body of John Wilkes Booth, the man who assassinated Abraham Lincoln, has been disputed almost since the moment it happened. The official account is clear. Booth shot Lincoln at Ford's Theater on April 14, 1865, fled south, and was tracked to a tobacco barn near Port Royal, Virginia, where he was shot by Union soldier Boston Corbett on April 26. His body was identified by several people who knew him, including his dentist, and was buried in an unmarked grave at the old Arsenal Penitentiary in Washington, then later moved to the Booth family plot at Greenmount Cemetery in Baltimore. But conspiracy theories have dogged the identification from the start. Some have claimed that the man killed in the barn was not Booth, but a look-alike, and that the real assassin escaped and lived for decades under assumed names. At least 2 men, Venus Bates' subject, John St. Helen, and a mummified body that toured as a sideshow attraction, have been put forward as the real Booth. Requests to exhume the body at Greenmount have been made several times but were denied by a court in 1995 on the grounds that disturbing the grave was unnecessary, as the identification had been sufficiently established by historical evidence. The Booth family plot remains intact and is one of the most visited graves at Greenmount Cemetery, though the cemetery understandably does not advertise its most infamous resident. If there is one grave in America that doesn't exist but should, it belongs to Jimmy Hoffa. The legendary president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, Hoffa was one of the most powerful labor leaders in American history, and one of the most corrupt, with deep ties to organized crime that landed him in federal prison. After serving 4 years of a 13-year sentence, he was pardoned by President Richard Nixon in 1971 under the condition that he stay out of union activities for 10 years. Hoffa immediately began maneuvering to regain control of the Teamsters, which put him on a collision course with the mobsters who had moved in during his absence. On July 30, 1975, Hoffa drove to the Machus Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township, Michigan, for a meeting with 2 mafia figures. He was never seen again. He was 62. The FBI has searched for Hoffa's body for nearly 5 decades, excavating sites across the Midwest, including a horse farm, a backyard swimming pool, a driveway, and even beneath the end zone of the former Giants Stadium in New Jersey. None of these searches found anything. Hoffa was declared legally dead in 1982. Theories about his fate range from the plausible, that he was killed and his body disposed of in a mob-connected waste facility, to the outlandish, that he was ground up and mixed into concrete for a construction project. The truth may never be known. The one thing that is certain is that somewhere in America, or possibly under it, Jimmy Hoffa remains hidden, the most famous missing body in the country. From a body that was never found to one that found its way to a Las Vegas Strip memorial before most of the controversy had even begun, we come to Tupac Shakur, the most debated death in the history of hip-hop. On September 7, 1996, Shakur was shot 4 times in a drive-by shooting in Las Vegas after attending a Mike Tyson boxing match. He died 6 days later at the age of 25. The case has never been officially solved to anyone's complete satisfaction, though a former Crips gang member named Dwayne "Keffy D. Davis was arrested and charged with murder in 2023, nearly 3 decades after the shooting. Davis claimed his nephew, Orlando Anderson, was the triggerman, and that the shooting was retaliation for a fight earlier that evening. But the conspiracy theories that surround Shakur's death are staggering in their scope. Some believe the killing was ordered by music executive Suge Knight. Others blame the East Coast/West Coast rap rivalry and point to associates of the notorious Big. And a dedicated subculture of believers insists that Tupac faked his own death and is living somewhere in Cuba or the Caribbean, pointing to his posthumous album releases, his use of the pseudonym Machiavelli, a reference to Machiavelli, who advocated faking one's death, and a series of alleged sightings around the world. Shakur was cremated, and some of his ashes were reportedly scattered in various locations. There is no traditional grave to visit, which has only fueled the mythology. In death, as in life, Tupac Shakur is everywhere and nowhere. From a man whose death spawned an industry of theories to one whose final years were themselves a mystery, we turn to Howard Hughes, the billionaire aviator, filmmaker, and industrialist who spent the last decade of his life as the most famous recluse in the world. Hughes had once been the most glamorous man in America, a dashing pilot who set speed records around the globe, a Hollywood producer who launched the careers of Jean Harlow and Jane Russell, and an aerospace innovator who built the Spruce Goose, the largest wooden airplane ever constructed. But by the mid-1960s, Hughes had retreated from public life entirely, living in sealed hotel penthouses in Las Vegas, the Bahamas, Nicaragua, and Mexico, attended only by a small circle of handlers. He became obsessed with germs, refused to cut his hair or nails, and reportedly subsisted on a diet of chocolate bars and milk. When he died on April 5, 1976, at the age of 70, aboard a private plane flying from Acapulco to Houston, he was nearly unrecognizable. 6'4" but weighing only 90 pounds, with hair down to his shoulders and fingernails several inches long. A broken hypodermic needle was embedded in his arm. The official cause of death was kidney failure. Hughes was buried at Glenwood Cemetery in Houston, in the family plot. The legal battle over his estate, estimated at $2.5 billion, lasted for decades and involved a forged will, competing claims from distant relatives, and allegations that his inner circle had kept him drugged and isolated to maintain control over his fortune. The man who once owned an airline, a movie studio, and half of Las Vegas ended up in a modest grave in Houston, his empire carved up by lawyers and strangers. From a man who disappeared into hotel rooms to a writer who disappeared into Mexico, we come to one of the great literary vanishing acts. Ambrose Bierce was one of the most celebrated American writers of the late 19th century. A Civil War veteran, a caustic newspaper columnist, and the author of tales of horror and the supernatural that influenced everyone from H.P. Lovecraft to Stephen King. His short story, An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, is taught in classrooms to this day. In October 1913, at the age of 71, Bierce traveled to Mexico to observe the revolution being led by Pancho Villa. He wrote a letter to a friend dated December 26, 1913, from Chihuahua, Mexico. It was the last anyone ever heard from him. Bierce simply vanished. No body was ever found. No evidence of his fate was ever discovered. Theories range from the mundane, he was killed in the Battle of Ojinaga in January 1914, to the romantic. He wandered off into the desert to die on his own terms. His famous closing line to a friend has become one of the most quoted in American letters. "As to me, I leave here tomorrow for an unknown destination." Without a body or a grave, Bierce exists solely in his words, which is perhaps exactly how he would have wanted it. Another famous disappearance from the same era of adventure and daring. Glenn Miller, the bandleader whose music defined the swing era and whose disappearance remains one of the great aviation mysteries of World War II. Miller led the most popular dance band in America in the late 1930s and early 1940s. In the Mood, Moonlight Serenade, and Chattanooga Choo Choo were his calling cards, and they sold millions. In 1942, at the age of 38, Miller enlisted in the Army Air Forces and organized a military band that entertained troops across Europe. On December 15, 1944, Miller boarded a single-engine UC-64 Norseman aircraft in England to fly to Paris, where he was scheduled to arrange concerts for soldiers recently liberated from German occupation. The plane disappeared over the English Channel. No wreckage was ever found. No body was ever recovered. Miller was 39. The official explanation is that the plane went down due to mechanical failure or icing in poor weather conditions, but over the decades, alternative theories have flourished. One holds that Miller's plane was accidentally struck by bombs being jettisoned by British bombers returning from an aborted mission over Germany. Another suggests that Miller actually made it to Paris and died in the arms of a French prostitute, with the military covering up the embarrassing truth. A cenotaph, a memorial with no body beneath it, marks Miller's name at the Cambridge American Cemetery in England, among thousands of American soldiers who died in the European theater. His actual resting place is the cold gray bottom of the English Channel, somewhere between England and France, keeping time with the tide. And where Glenn Miller vanished over water, Amelia Earhart vanished over an ocean. The most famous female aviator in history, Earhart set records, broke barriers, and became a global icon of courage and independence. On July 2, 1937, during her attempt to circumnavigate the globe, Earhart and her navigator Fred Noonan disappeared over the central Pacific Ocean somewhere near Howland Island. She was 39. The search that followed was the most expensive and extensive naval operation of its time, covering 250,000 square miles of ocean. Nothing was found. The official conclusion was that the plane ran out of fuel and went down at sea. But theories about Earhart's fate have never stopped. One holds that she crash-landed on Nikumaroro, an uninhabited island in the Republic of Kiribati, and survived for a time as a castaway. In support of this, researchers have found artifacts on the island: a piece of plexiglass, a woman's shoe, animal bones that show signs of being cooked, though nothing definitive. Another theory, promoted during and after World War II, held that Earhart was captured by the Japanese military and either executed or held as a prisoner. This theory was largely debunked, but refuses to die. A cenotaph in Earhart's honor stands at the portal of the Atchison, Kansas, home where she was born. Her name is also inscribed on a memorial at Hollywood Forever Cemetery of all places, though she has no earthly resting place. Like D.B. Cooper, she belongs to the sky. From the modern era of unexplained vanishings, let us travel to the ancient world and the most famous curse in all of archaeology. In November 1922, British archaeologist Howard Carter broke through the sealed doorway of a tomb in the Valley of the Kings near Luxor, Egypt, and gazed upon the treasures of Tutankhamun, the boy king who had ruled Egypt over 3,000 years earlier. The discovery was the greatest archaeological find in history. What happened next became one of the greatest legends. Lord Carnarvon, the wealthy British aristocrat who had financed the excavation, died on April 5, 1923, less than 5 months after the tomb was opened, from an infected mosquito bite that led to pneumonia and blood poisoning. He was 56. The press immediately pounced on the idea of a mummy's curse, the notion that anyone who disturbed the pharaoh's rest would be struck down. And indeed, a number of people connected to the excavation died in the years that followed, though careful analysis shows that most of them lived to perfectly ordinary ages and died of perfectly ordinary causes. Carter himself, who spent more time in the tomb than anyone, lived until 1939, dying at the age of 64. The curse is almost certainly bunk, but it is one of the most persistent and widely believed legends in the world, and it turned King Tut's tomb into the most visited site in the Valley of the Kings. The treasures are now housed in the Grand Egyptian Museum in Cairo, and the tomb itself remains open to visitors. The curse, like the king, endures. From ancient Egypt to modern Mississippi, we come to a grave that became a symbol of the American Civil Rights Movement and the power of bearing witness. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old boy from Chicago who was visiting relatives in Money, Mississippi, in the summer of 1955, when he was accused of whistling at or making a remark to a white woman, Carolyn Bryant, in a grocery store. On August 28th, Till was kidnapped from his great-uncle's home by Bryant's husband Roy and his half-brother, J.W. Milam. His mutilated body was pulled from the Tallahatchie River 3 days later. His mother, Mamie Till Mobley, made the decision to hold an open casket funeral, insisting that the world see what had been done to her son. The photographs of Till's battered face were published in Jet magazine and the Chicago Defender and became one of the most important catalysts of the civil rights movement. Bryant and Milam were acquitted by an all-white jury in September 1955, then later confessed to the murder in a paid interview with Look magazine, protected by double jeopardy. Till was buried at Burr Oak Cemetery in Alsip, Illinois. In 2005, his body was exhumed for an autopsy as part of a renewed federal investigation. The original glass-topped casket, which Mamie had insisted on to display her son's injuries, was found abandoned in a shed at the cemetery during a separate investigation into the cemetery's mismanagement. The casket was donated to the Smithsonian Institution, where it is now on display at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Emmett Till was reburied in a new casket. The woman whose accusations set the horror in motion, Carolyn Bryant, admitted decades later that she had fabricated portions of her testimony. Till's grave remains one of the most visited and most solemn sites in the Chicago area. From a story that defined an era to a death that seemed almost scripted for the tabloids, we turn to Carl Alfalfa Switzer, one of the original child stars of the Our Gang comedies, The Little Rascals, who met one of the most ironic ends in Hollywood history. Switzer was one of the most recognizable kids in America in the 1930s, famous for his cowlick, his off-key singing, and his lovable mischief as Alfalfa. But like so many child actors, he struggled in adulthood. He worked as a bartender, a hunting guide, and a dog trainer, never able to escape the shadow of the character he'd played as a boy. On January 21, 1959, Switzer went to the home of a man named Moses Bud Stilts to collect a $50 debt over a hunting dog. The argument escalated, and Stilts shot Switzer in the groin with a pistol. Switzer was 31 years old. The shooting was ruled justifiable homicide. Stilts claimed self-defense, saying Switzer had come at him with a knife. Friends of Switzer disputed this, saying he was unarmed and that Stilts had provoked the confrontation. Only 14 people attended Switzer's funeral. He is buried at Hollywood Forever Cemetery, in a section far from the monuments of the silent-era stars. The child who made millions laugh died over a $50 argument about a dog. From a child star's tragic end to a trailblazer's mysterious one, we come to Dorothy Dandridge, the first African-American woman to be nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actress for her 1954 performance in Carmen Jones. Dandridge was stunningly beautiful, enormously talented, and trapped by the racial barriers of her era. Despite her Oscar nomination and her success in films like Island in the Sun and Porgy and Bess, she was denied the roles and opportunities routinely given to white actresses of lesser talent. Her personal life was marked by heartbreak, a failed marriage, a daughter born with severe brain damage, and a series of exploitative relationships with powerful men, including director Otto Preminger. By the early 1960s, Dandridge was broke, her career in ruins. On September 8, 1965, she was found dead in her West Hollywood apartment at the age of 42. The official cause was an overdose of an antidepressant. Whether the overdose was intentional or accidental has never been definitively established. Dandridge is buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California. Halle Berry, who won the Best Actress Oscar in 2002, becoming the first black woman to do so since Dandridge's nomination nearly 50 decades earlier, dedicated her award to Dandridge, saying, "This moment is so much bigger than me." We visited Bruce Lee and his son Brandon earlier, but the theme of a cursed production deserves one more look through the specific lens of Brandon Lee's death on the set of The Crow. On March 31, 1993, during the filming of a scene in which his character is shot by a group of thugs, a prop gun discharged a real projectile, a bullet tip that had become lodged in the barrel from a previous scene using improperly made dummy rounds. The fragment struck Brandon in the abdomen, and he died during surgery. He was 28. The film was completed using a combination of body doubles, digital effects, and rewritten scenes. And it became a massive commercial and critical success upon its release in 1994, which only deepened the tragedy. The eerie parallels with his father's death, both dying young, both at the peak of their careers, both under unusual circumstances, reignited talk of the Lee family curse. Investigators ultimately ruled Brandon's death a tragic accident caused by negligence in the handling of firearms on set. The incident led to major changes in safety protocols for film productions. Brandon rests beside his father at Lakeview Cemetery in Seattle, a son returned to his father's side. From the tragedies of the famous, let us pause at a grave that belongs to nobody famous at all, and yet is one of the most visited and most puzzling in the entire state of Utah. At Salt Lake City Cemetery, a simple headstone marks the grave of Lily E. Gray, who died on November 14, 1958. Below her name and dates is a single bewildering inscription: "Victim of the Beast 666. No one knows exactly what it means. Lily Gray was, by all available evidence, an ordinary woman who lived an ordinary life. The inscription was placed by her second husband, Elmer Gray, who was described by those who knew him as eccentric and deeply distrustful of the government. Some researchers have speculated that the beast 666 inches referred to the government itself, or the prison system, or some personal grievance that Elmer never explained. Others have wondered if it was a reference to the Book of Revelation. Elmer Gray died in 1964 without ever clarifying the matter. The grave has become a tourist attraction, drawing visitors who are fascinated by the mystery and the macabre inscription. It's a reminder that you don't need to be famous to leave behind a puzzle. And sometimes, you don't need to be dead either. In St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 in New Orleans, the same cemetery where we visited Marie Laveau at the start of our journey, there stands a gleaming white pyramid tomb, 9 feet tall, utterly out of place among the crumbling 18th century crypts that surround it. It belongs to Nicolas Cage, the Academy Award-winning actor who is very much alive. Cage purchased the pyramid tomb in 2010, reportedly without informing the cemetery or the city in advance, and its sudden appearance sparked outrage among preservationists and locals who felt it clashed with the historic character of the graveyard. The tomb bears no inscription, no name, nothing but blank white stone. Cage has never publicly explained why he chose a pyramid, or why he wanted to be buried in New Orleans' most famous cemetery. Theories range from a fascination with Egyptian mysticism to a belief in the occult to simple Hollywood eccentricity. Cage, after all, is the man who once owned a dinosaur skull, a Tarzana mansion that was once Bela Lugosi's, and 2 cobras. A pyramid tomb seems almost restrained by comparison. What makes it genuinely mysterious is the silence surrounding it. Cage has dodged every question about the tomb in every interview, and the blank surface offers no clues. In a cemetery full of the dead who cannot speak, here is a monument from the living who will not. From an enigmatic inscription to an enigmatic death, let's ride out to the frontier town of Deadwood, South Dakota, and the grave of Wild Bill Hickok, the legendary gunfighter, lawman, and folk hero who was murdered while playing poker on August 2nd, 1876. James Butler, Wild Bill Hickok, was one of the most famous figures of the American West. a Civil War scout, a U.S. Marshal, and a crack shot who was said to have killed dozens of men in gunfights, though the actual number was likely far fewer. He came to Deadwood during the Black Hills Gold Rush and was playing cards at Nuttall and Mann's saloon when a drifter named Jack McCall walked up behind him and shot him in the back of the head. Hickok was 39. The hand he was holding at the time, 2 pair, aces and eights, has been known as the dead man's hand ever since. McCall was initially acquitted by an informal minors' court, but was later retried by a federal court, convicted, and hanged. Hickok was buried at Mount Moriah Cemetery, which overlooks Deadwood from a hillside. His grave is one of the most visited in the American West, and fans leave cards, coins, and bottles of whiskey at the marker. Beside him, at her own request, lies Calamity Jane, Martha Jane Canary, who died in 1903 and who always claimed, despite scant evidence, that she and Hickok had been romantically involved. Some historians believe her request to be buried beside Wild Bill was the final act of a woman who spent her life turning her own legend into something larger than the truth. From the Wild West to the hills of Tennessee, we come to one of the great love stories of American music, and a pair of graves that tell the story's final chapter. Johnny Cash and June Carter Cash are buried side by side at Hendersonville Memory Gardens in Hendersonville, Tennessee, about 30 miles from the Grand Ole Opry. Their story is one of the most beloved in country music. Cash, the man in black, whose deep voice and darker impulses nearly destroyed him, and June, the bright-spirited daughter of country music royalty, whose love and stubbornness helped save him. They married in 1968 after years of on-again, off-again courtship, and they stayed together until the end. June died on May 15, 2003, at the age of 73, following complications from heart valve replacement surgery. Johnny was devastated. He continued performing, insisting on keeping scheduled appearances, and told audiences, "The spirit of June Carter overshadows me tonight." He died less than 4 months later, on September 12, 2003, at the age of 71, from complications of diabetes. Many who knew him said he died of a broken heart. The fact that they died within 4 months of each other, and now rest side by side, is the final verse of a love song that lasted 35 years. Fans visit the graves regularly, leaving guitar picks, flowers, and handwritten notes. Some claim to hear the faint sound of music on quiet evenings at the cemetery, though whether it's Cash or Carter or just the Tennessee wind depends on who's listening. From the certainty of a great love to the uncertainty of a disputed grave, we ride west to Glenwood Springs, Colorado, and the alleged final resting place of Doc Holliday. John Henry Holliday was a dentist turned gambler turned gunfighter, famous for his friendship with Wyatt Earp and his role in the gunfight at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona, in 1881. Holliday suffered from tuberculosis for most of his adult life and traveled to Glenwood Springs in 1887, hoping the mountain air might help. It didn't. He died on November 8, 1887, at the age of 36, reportedly saying on his deathbed, as he looked down at his bare feet, "This is funny," because he had always expected to die with his boots on. The problem is that no one knows exactly where he's buried. A marker at Linwood Cemetery in Glenwood Springs claims the spot, but the actual grave was on a hillside that has since been covered by development, and records from the era are incomplete. Some researchers believe Holliday's body may have been moved. Others think it's still there, somewhere beneath the streets and homes of modern Glenwood Springs. The existing marker attracts thousands of visitors each year who are happy to take it on faith, even if the exact location of Doc's bones remains, like the man himself, a little bit elusive. From the West's most elusive gambler to Hollywood's original blonde bombshell, we come to Jean Harlow, the platinum-haired sensation who blazed through 1930s Hollywood like a comet and burned out just as fast. Harlow was the biggest female star in America by the time she was 22, famous for films like Red Dust, Dinner at 8, and Bombshell. She was funny, sexy, and magnetic in a way that the screen couldn't contain. She was also desperately unlucky in love. Her second husband, MGM producer Paul Byrne, was found dead of a gunshot wound just 2 months after their wedding, in a case that was ruled an act by his own hand, but has been debated ever since. Some believe Byrne was murdered by a former common-law wife who appeared at the house that night. Others think the studio covered up the circumstances to protect Harlow's image. Harlow herself died on June 7, 1937, at the age of 26, of kidney failure, which her mother's Christian Science beliefs had prevented from being treated promptly. The studio tried to keep Harlow working even as she visibly deteriorated on camera, and co-star Clark Gable reportedly carried her between takes during the filming of Saratoga, her final film. Harlow is interred in the Great Mausoleum at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, in a private room reportedly purchased by her boyfriend William Powell for $25,000, a fortune in 1937. The exact location within the mausoleum is not open to public visitation, which adds a layer of mystery to a life that was already full of it. From a death that cut short the brightest career of its era to a crash that silenced three of the brightest voices in rock and roll overnight, we come to the story of Buddy Holly and the day the music died. On February 3, 1959, a small chartered plane carrying Holly, Ritchie Valens, and J.P. the Big Bopper Richardson crashed in a cornfield near Clear Lake, Iowa, killing all three musicians and the pilot. Holly was 22. The cause was determined to be pilot error in adverse weather conditions, but a persistent conspiracy theory emerged over the years, suggesting that a gun carried on the plane may have discharged accidentally, contributing to the crash. In 2007, Richardson's son, attempting to settle the question, had his father's body exhumed and examined. The autopsy found no evidence of gunshot trauma, which helped put at least that theory to rest. Holly is buried at the City of Lubbock Cemetery in Lubbock, Texas, his hometown. His headstone features his real name, Charles Hardin Holly, and a carving of a guitar. The crash site near Clear Lake has become a pilgrimage destination, marked by a steel monument in the shape of a guitar and 3 records. Don McLean immortalized the tragedy in his 1971 song, American Pie, and the phrase, "the day the music died," entered the American language. Holly's influence on popular music is incalculable. The Beatles took their name as a nod to Holly's crickets, and John Lennon once said that without Buddy Holly, the Beatles would never have existed. From rock and roll's darkest day to one of America's most extraordinary mystics, we turn to Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet, whose grave in Hopkinsville, Kentucky belies one of the most unusual lives in American history. Cayce was a devout Christian and a modest photographer who discovered, in the early 1900s, that when he entered a self-induced trance state, he could diagnose medical conditions and prescribe treatments for people he had never met, often with remarkable accuracy. Over the course of 43 years, Cayce gave over 14,000 documented readings covering health, past lives, ancient civilizations, and prophecies about the future. He predicted the stock market crash of 1929, the beginning of World War II, and, less successfully, the discovery of Atlantis. The medical establishment dismissed him as a fraud. His followers regarded him as a genuine psychic. Cayce died on January 3, 1945, at the age of 67, of a stroke, reportedly having warned years earlier that taking on too many readings would kill him. He is buried at Riverside Cemetery in Hopkinsville. The Association for Research and Enlightenment, which he founded in Virginia Beach, Virginia, continues to archive and study his readings. Whether Cayce was a charlatan or a genuine clairvoyant is a debate that has outlived him by 80 years. What is not in dispute is the sincerity of his belief in what he was doing. Cayce never became wealthy from his readings, often performed them for free, and seemed genuinely distressed by his inability to explain his own abilities. Our journey has taken us across the country and across the centuries, from voodoo queens to vanished aviators, from cursed cars to stolen skulls, from crossroads deals with the devil to seances that never reached the dead. We've visited graves that hold answers no one can access and graves that hold questions no one can resolve. We've met legends who became ghosts and ghosts who became legends. And now, for our final stop, we come to a grave that contains a secret, but this one is a love story. Humphrey Bogart, the man who played Sam Spade, The man who said, "Here's looking at you, kid." The man who won the Academy Award for the African Queen and who embodied tough, cynical, heartbroken cool for an entire generation, died on January 14, 1957, of esophageal cancer. He was 57. He had spent the final year of his life in declining health, growing gaunt and frail, but he never lost his wit. When friends visited him at his Holmby Hills home, he insisted on cocktails and conversation, maintaining the persona to the last. His funeral was attended by the biggest names in Hollywood, and his friend John Huston delivered the eulogy, saying, "He is quite irreplaceable. There will never be another like him." Bogart was cremated, and his ashes were placed in an urn and interred at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, in the Garden of Memory section, which is not open to the general public. But here is the detail that elevates this story from Hollywood history into something deeper. Inside the urn, placed there by his wife, Lauren Bacall, is a small gold whistle. It was a reference to their first film together, To Have and Have Not, in which the 19-year-old Bacall delivered the line that would define both their careers and their marriage. "You know how to whistle, don't you, Steve? You just put your lips together and blow." Bacall kept a matching whistle. When she died in 2014 at the age of 89, she was cremated as well, but she chose to be buried at Forest Lawn, not beside Bogart. She is in a different section of the cemetery. But somewhere in the Garden of Memory, inside a sealed urn, that little gold whistle sits with Bogey. A private message from a wife to a husband, from a young girl to the tough guy who turned out to be the love of her life. It is, perhaps, the most romantic object in any grave in America, and almost no one knows it's there. And with that, our journey comes to its end. We've walked a long road tonight, through cemeteries and legends, through mysteries solved and unsolvable, through the final chapters of lives that were anything but ordinary. Every grave we visited had a story, and every story had a shadow. That's what makes these places so compelling. They remind us that the line between what we know and what we'll never know is as thin as marble and as permanent. Thank you for walking with us. Rest well tonight. And if you hear a whistle in the dark, well, you know what to do.